Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 145 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 350 partnering organizations from around the world that have come together during this extraordinary pandemic we're all undergoing to provide a daily common ground so people can come together to share their experiences, ideas, solutions, visions, and confer on how we can work together more effectively to ensure that the post-pandemic world is more abundant and sustainable and resilient and healthy and in alignment with natural systems. As we've traversed the months now, during which the pandemic has seeped into the culture in very, I would say, pernicious and inexorable ways. We've covered all manner of issues of human concern from all over the world. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on the US election. And I'm very happy to report today that the head of the government service organization, the GSO, which is mandated by law to trigger the transition from the old president to the new president, has given what they call her ascertainment. So the wheels of both legality, constitutional process are underway in the United States. And as you all know, given what we know about Donald Trump and his persistent efforts to undermine both the democratic institutions and then the election itself, using every trick in the books and foreign assistance, which is an act of treason, still the American people, in what I believe to be probably, I can't think of a more profoundly important, positive event in 2020. Than the fact that the American people, despite the President of the United States working from the White House to undermine the democratic process in every way he could, the American people showed up to vote in record-breaking numbers. And not only that, hundreds of thousands of people, ordinary people, supported the electoral process and ensured that the longest continuous democracy in the history of the world was preserved. That's quite an achievement. And I just want to acknowledge it on the day that finally, 3 weeks after the election, which is today, the Trump administration has begun the process of conceding. Now, let me just add the whiplash, because Trump has got 2 months left and he's doing extraordinary damage in a fit of both vindictiveness and doing what he can now to shovel things out the door or in the door that he can get away with. Little quick example. At the end of the Cold War, the United States and 33 other countries signed the Open Sky Agreement, believing then and believing now that if major countries around the world had the capacity to fly surveillance planes over each other's territory, a spirit of transparency would ensue, and people, by just checking up on others, United States on the Soviet Union, now Russia, Russia on the United States, the US and China, overflights. Trump administration, at the request of Vladimir Putin, has abrogated that open sky treaty, and not only abrogated one of the most important treaties that keeps the world safe through transparency, but they've actually destroyed the two specially designed airplanes that were regularly flying over Russia. I offer this so that we can hold both the grandeur of a country bending but not breaking, and yet the afterburn, the riptide of a president that is still not officially conceded. And what he's doing to toxify the ongoing environment at a moment when, for the 20th day in a row, the United States has suffered over 100,000 new COVID cases, with over 83,000 Americans now in the hospital, and one American dying every 60 seconds, with more and more cities running out of room for the dead in their morgues. So while the president is doing the bidding of Putin and destroying airplanes that could bring transparency with what the Russians are doing, he hasn't said anything about COVID in nearly 3 weeks. So that's sort of the measure of the world that we are in and that we have to navigate, both the good and the bad, the subterranean and the very public. And Humanity Rising has been offering, as we've traversed the months now, sort of a rendition of history as we've been moving along, so that we can all hold the greater container that is the world in November of 2020, as we all begin to bring a year of devastating impact to a close. One of the things that we've done consistently every day, just so that we can keep our equilibrium as we navigate through these waters, is meditating every day around heart coherence. So just take a moment, a few deep breaths, and in the midst of the contradictions, place your attention on your heart. And in a spirit of gratitude, just express the joy of being alive at this extraordinary moment in human history. For every choice we make, every heartbeat we take matters. Thank you, everyone. One of the themes that we've been developing from the very beginning of Humanity Rising is a new vision of the world and humanity and our relationship to everything that is coming out of science. And we've had cosmologists, we've had physicists, we've had neuroscientists, we've had all manner of people making a basic assertion that it is out of science that a new story is emerging, a new description of the cosmos, of being itself, that can provide us with a new vision of human identity and human future. So I'm particularly delighted today to welcome Peter Mary back, who comes to us every once in a while with his honored guests to talk about one of the great physicists of the 20th century, David Bohm, and the unity of everything. So Peter, welcome. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jim. Yeah, so it's a great honor today to have Nish Dubashia with us, who I will introduce in a moment. I just wanted to tell the story of how I ended up meeting him, because it was a meeting full of synchronicities where I was reading a book about the Bohm Krishnamurti dialogues. And I was reading some of Bohm's stuff and I was thinking, this is so aligned with evolution theory, which is what I developed in my PhD at Ubiquity, that I need to find somebody who really understands Bohm so that I can check I'm understanding it properly and see if the assumptions I'm making actually do fit. And so I was just Googling around, and it took me to a book review of this book called The Unity of Everything, written by Nish Dubashia. So I searched for Nish Dubashia, couldn't find him exactly because he had a slightly different name on Facebook. But it turns out there he was. And not only that, but he was connected to the integral communities and connected to the spiral dynamics communities that I'm very much involved in. And so I reached out, and Nish got back to me, and we set up a call. And it's one of those kind of conversations where, in a completely effortless way, all the connections and synchronicities flow. And we luckily had the presence of mind to press the record button on Zoom before we started the conversation. And I've ended up since then having 6 dialogues that we put on a YouTube channel called Integral Reflections on Science and Spirituality, about 9 hours of conversation. I kind of was thinking, I don't know if anybody's got the time or the space to actually kind of sit down and go deep on some topics and, listen to that long of a conversation, but we thought we'd see anyway. And we've had kind of hundreds of people come through and watch them. So it was in that context that we had those conversations. And the reason that this is important, I think, this whole topic around unity, is, for me, it feels like the core challenge that we have at the moment as humanity is literally to remember our interconnectedness, to remember, to put it back together again. Because if we had a perspective that believed in interconnectedness, if we felt deeply the interconnectedness of all things, then our behavior would intrinsically reflect that in the way we treat other people and in the way we treat the planet and other life on Earth. Yet somehow we've forgotten that interconnectedness. And so when I came across Nish's work and the simple concept that he presented to David Bohm that seems to connect up many of the different theories in the religions, then I was like, this is a really important piece of the puzzle that will help people to see the interconnectedness, to see what it is that connects all these different traditions up, and that also, of course, from Bohm's background, connects up the science and the spiritual perspective. So, Nish, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Humanity Rising.
Thank you very much. Hello there, and yeah, thank you for having me on here.
Yeah. I think what might be nice for people is to start off with just a little bit of your life story, you know, leading up to the conversation with David Bohm. And then what we can do is go into a little bit the model that you were sharing with him, and then we can build on some of the various themes. And I should say that it wasn't just the synchronicity around David Bohm with Nish, but it was also the time he'd spent with J. Krishnamurti and his community. So he'd got both of these pieces that had resonated so strongly with me. So we'll be exploring the kind of themes that were also came out of the dialogues between Bohm and Krishnamurti. But Nish, do start us off with just a little bit of your story and how you came to actually meet this great man.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll give a quick overview of my life up to the point when I met David Bohm. I was born in 1966 in London, and I'm a second generation immigrant. My parents are originally from India. I was born in London, and we went back to India actually, and I lived in India for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. And then we came back to the UK, and I've been in the UK ever since. While I was in India, in my first few years, I was introduced to Hindu mythology by my grandfather, and I found myself being quite absorbed in those stories. And that was kind of my first introduction to the spiritual dimension of life, quite early in life. And upon returning to the UK, my best friend in school introduced me to the Bible. So I spent most of my childhood absorbed in Hindu stories, in Christian stories, later in Buddhist stories. So spirituality at a childhood level played quite a major role in my early life. As I went into my teens, I found that there were different areas in my life where I started to experience a state which you could refer to perhaps as the state of no self, of self being temporarily absent, and in everything coming together in a unified way. I'll give you 3 very quick examples. I was a mathematics student. I found when I was doing mathematics, doing complex calculations and proofs, that there were these temporary experiences of no self, where everything came together and the whole of the mathematics just came together as a coherent whole. I was an amateur athlete. I ran the 400 meters. Again, a similar experience when competing in athletics and running and racing, there was this experience of no self. Something else would take over, and I would be absent for that 1 minute that I was running. I was also a musician. I played the violin, similar kind of experience. Playing music, self was absent. There was a unity with what was going on around me, and something else seemed to take over. So I always wondered I was always familiar with this experience of no self, and always wondered what that actually was, where that was actually coming from. In my teenage years, for several years, under the influence of a friend from school, became quite engrossed in evangelical forms of Christianity, which was kind of my teenage spirituality. But the real change and the real transformation, in my view, came when I became a student at the University of Warwick, where I went to study mathematics. And that's where I discovered for the first time the teachings of Krishnamurti. And I also discovered a book called The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra that showed similarities between Eastern mysticism and some of the findings of modern physics. Also at university, surrounded by thousands of books, a lot of critical thinking came in. The more evangelical Christian belief of my teenage started to fall apart, and there was a move towards this new orientation: Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Krishnamurti. And I started to take up spiritual practices. I was fortunate enough to be studying near a Buddhist monastery, where I studied under a community of Theravada Buddhist monks, and I took up Theravada Buddhist meditation, that in different forms I've continued till today. I also lived literally about 100 meters away from a Taoist master, which was an incredible synchronicity, called Master Chi Su, and I started Taoist yoga practices with Chi Su. And then I discovered the writings of David Bohm, initially through Krishnamurti, and that seemed to give a very strong theoretical, mathematically precise, philosophically precise foundation for what I was coming to move into and coming to experience. I started to work in London after I left university and continued spiritual practice, huge amounts of reading. And there I discovered the work of Ken Wilber and his integral thinking, which would also play a huge role in the development of my worldview. And it was round about now, in my early 20s, that I started to see that there were some essential common components between the different traditions that I was studying and practicing, between the different teachers that I was reading and studying. And on that basis, I tried to look at these essential components and put together some kind of model that I hoped would be the essence of what everybody was trying to say in their dozens or hundreds of different ways. And then, rather audaciously, I sent this model and a paper explaining this model to David Bohm, who was at that time teaching at Birkbeck College in London, literally a few miles from where I was working. And I really didn't expect to hear from him ever again. But 2 weeks later, I actually received a phone call at home from David Bohm, inviting me to his office at Birkbeck College to discuss the model and its implications and its connections with his work. And so in January 1991, I traveled to Birkbeck College and spent a couple of quite amazing hours in discussion with David Bohm. And that formed the essence of what would later become my book, The Unity of Everything, which would contain that conversation. So that's a brief summary of how I ended up meeting David Bohm.
Right. Thank you, Nish. What a wonderful overview of quite a special life that unfolded over that time. I think it'd be really fascinating to start off by just having a look at that, model that you sent to Bohm, and because he was very appreciative of it. If you in the book, The Unity of Everything, he resonates very strongly with it, and then goes into some more detail about it as well. But I think it's very exciting for the way that it does potentially show the patterns behind these different religious and cultural expressions of a truth, and it's such an art form to try to find the words or the language to describe interconnectedness, because you kind of always seems to edge on the poetic, to be able to get beyond, in a way, something that the rational mind might think up as something that separates things, but to be able to find the language to describe a pattern that connects is a real art form. So, and I think you obviously having both the mathematical background and the spiritual background, somehow these pieces kind of combined in you to give you this insight, as Krishnamurti would call it, rather than thought. And we'll come maybe to the distinction about that later, that enabled you to presence, I think, this model. So I'll share the the slides now, and just let me know when you want to move on, and what you would, when you're ready to, describe the next step, as it were.
Okay.
So I'll put this into presentation mode. There we go. So would you like to say anything about the name first, or move to this to the first slide?
Well, just going back a step, where you said such a model would come from insight rather than thought, I'd just say that, yes, that's exactly how it did happen. It kind of presented itself to me in one moment. It wasn't something that came piecemeal. The whole structure sort of revealed itself in one go. And I just called it the diamond model because part of it looks like a diamond, just to give it a name.
Great. Okay, here we go. Over to you.
Okay, so shall I give a quick summary of the model?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, if you have a look at the model, if we'll start, the easiest place to start is probably from 2 lines up from the bottom where it says multiplicity, because that's the aspect of reality that we are the most familiar with, I think, most of the time. So by multiplicity, I simply mean the world of separate things and separate events. Things that are separated by space, events that are separated by time. This is the normal 3-dimensional world in which we seem to live our lives most of the time. Now, one of the key insights that seemed to me to be there in pretty much everything I was reading and studying and experiencing to some degree was that this world of multiplicity, or world of parts, underlying this world of multiplicity is a deeper wholeness, a deeper oneness, a deeper non-duality, some traditions might call it. We'll go into that in more detail later. But a basic oneness behind the many. A unity of everything that we don't normally see or perceive, but that is in some sense the true or truer or deeper nature of the world in which we live. And many of these traditions and teachers, including David Bohm particularly, talk about how the world of multiplicity emerges out of this deeper whole and returns to that deeper whole. So the 2 essential components that everybody seemed to be talking about was the whole, this underlying oneness or unity, and the world of parts, multiplicity. One of the problems that we see in the world around us, the conflicts, the violence within ourselves, personal, interpersonal, much of that, many of the traditions talk about, and David Bohm in particularly emphasized, was the result of us taking this process of division that results in the whole manifesting as multiplicity. We take that process of division too far. And so multiplicity, which by itself can be quite a healthy place to be and a natural place to be, becomes fragmentation. The parts become fragments. And we can do this in one of 2 ways. We can divide things that are not really divided, and we can unify things that are not really united. So we create parts that are not really parts. Now, I'll give you a couple of obvious examples. When we divide the human race into different races, and if we take that division too far, which can lead to all kinds of problems, obviously, that is an example of how multiplicity can become fragmentation. Or when we take the fact that there are different religions in the world, if we take those divisions too seriously or take them too far, that can become an example of fragmentation, which obviously results in all kinds of problems and conflicts and violence.
Nish,
So,
would it be fair to say that the multiplicity is the natural diversity of things? The fact that, if we look at life, we would celebrate the distinction and the difference between things. That's what brings the diversity. And then what seems to happen at fragmentation is like we forget that multiplicity is connected within the whole, right? So in a way, fragmentation is multiplicity without the whole. Would that fit?
I think, yes, that's exactly right. I think multiplicity, the whole and multiplicity in reality are two sides of the same coin. Multiplicity has no real meaning or basis without that underlying whole. But in our thinking, in our consciousness, we lose sight of the whole. And when we do that, multiplicity becomes a realm by itself, disconnected from the whole. And that's when multiplicity becomes fragmentation. And that's when in practice we start creating divisions that are not really there, or we take divisions that are merely functional and start regarding them as absolute. And that then causes all kinds of problems. But yes, that's exactly right. When we disconnect multiplicity from the whole, when we lose sight of the wholeness, which seems to be a universal problem at the moment, then we move to a world of fragmentation and essentially a world of violence and conflict.
I mean, it's a really important distinction, I think, those two, because, you have movements that would say, oh, it's all one, and we shouldn't even be thinking in terms of difference and separation. And yet that's the reality we live. So that doesn't seem to kind of fit our experience. And the diversity is also there to celebrate. So to say, there is, that's a good thing. The distinction, I'd say, the distinctions in terms of maybe separation instead of separation, the distinctions are really important. That's life. That's what life does. We have this kind of process of things becoming ever more refined in a way, therefore greater diversity. And so it's important to keep that as part of the puzzle and not disappear into it's all one kind of place, but to be here in this diversity and to make that distinction and to say you've got that. And then if we forget the interconnectedness, or if we pull these things apart and, as you say, see them as absolute parts, as it were, rather than in relationship to others, then we get into this fragmentation that creates so many of the problems that we have today.
Yes, that's a very important point, I think, that some of the traditions or some approaches have emphasized or taught that only the whole is real, and that multiplicity, even healthy multiplicity, diversity of any kind, is an illusion or it's a problem. My view here, when I spoke to David Bohm, he was in full agreement with this, is that approach itself is a fragmentation, because we're dividing something that isn't really separate, which is the whole and multiplicity. They also go together. And when you separate the whole from multiplicity and say that one of those alone is real and the other is in some sense unreal, you've already moved into an area of fragmentation.
Yeah. I mean, there's some of the language that's often used in more of the spiritual movements is the distinction between the absolute and the relative. There's the absolute kind of, which I think would be equivalent to the whole here, and the relative is obviously the things that are related to each other, so that are distinguished from each other. And I think it was Ken Wilber says, it's often people confuse that the absolute with what he would call the non-dual. He says the non-dual is when you can hold both the absolute, so the whole, and the relative, the multiplicity, as both being true at the same time. So therefore, it's not about escaping from the relative or the multiplicity into the kind of whole or the absolute, as it were. Because you say that then splits whole from multiplicity or absolute from relative. So then that's dual by its nature. And so the non-dual is when you can hold absolute and relative at the same time.
Yes, I agree. And that actually is what is signified on the model by the ground, which you can see at the top of the model. The ground, there I'm using it again in the way that Bohm and Krishnamurti used the term. And they used the term in a way that was equivalent to the way Ken Wilber uses the term non-dual, which you've just described, which is that the whole and the multiplicity go together. They're two sides of the same coin. They're both equally real. They're both equally important. And the final realization, if you like, or the final stage of waking up, another way of putting it, is to actually realize that non-duality and ultimate non-difference between the whole and multiplicity, and to privilege neither.
Yeah. And you know what for me, what that does for my experience or engagement with life is when I can know that there is the whole, it's all interconnected, and there's the multiplicity, then I can kind of release myself to play in the world of things, right? With a kind of lightness, because I know ultimately it's all connected, right? But it enables you to not feel guilty, as it were, about being in the world of matter, because that's parts what some of these traditions do. Is you've got to get beyond the body, you've got to get beyond matter. It's all an illusion, and yet when you hold it like this, it's all connected, and then we get to enjoy. I mean, we incarnated for a reason, right? In this relative world, we didn't incarnate here and then just to disappear out of it. We incarnated here to play and contribute to this beautiful diversity that there is on Earth and this multiplicity. And when we're able to hold the whole and that together in the non-dual, then it makes we don't get lost then in the multiplicity, right? Because we continue to remember that it's all interconnected in the whole. And that's I think that what makes for the most effective, let's say I'd call spiritual activism or spiritually informed activism. So people who are really wanting to make a difference in the world, but are also holding a kind of little smile as we realize that, it is all actually interconnected and a bigger whole than we can ever grasp, with any part of our mind or anything else.
Yes, in fact, while you were saying that, what I came to mind is in the Hindu tradition, the whole is one way they symbolize that is by the god Shiva, whereas multiplicity is represented by the goddess Shakti, or you can think of it as the male and the female. And some of these traditions, for example, you see this in Advaita Vedanta or in Theravada Buddhism, the emphasis is more to realize the whole, in Hindu language to realize Shiva. And Shakti, in a way, is an illusion or even a mistake. Whereas, so the creation of the world is a mistake. We need to get out of here and get back to the whole as quickly as we can, because this life is nothing but suffering. That's the approach that they take. But there's I think, a deeper approach where Shiva and Shakti are two halves of the same reality, of the same oneness, and you need both. They come together, the male and the female come together. The male and the female are both equally important, and they come together in union, and it's in that union that you truly find wholeness.
Yeah. And it's, when it is denied, it's part of this kind of movement that focuses purely on the transcendent. And as you say, that relates to the kind of masculine God, as it were, out of here in the transcendent. And that goes hand in hand with the time when the feminine started getting so suppressed as well. And we moved away from the earth, away from the body, away from the emotional, and it all had to be transcendent of the material. We weren't allowed to just, engage with the material, which was in the kind of Western story at the same time that is the slide still showing?
No.
Yeah.
No, I just giving people a break so they could see your face. That's all.
Okay. Sorry, Rick. That's okay. So that it was the same time in the kind of Western tradition that when the religions emerged, as it were, and suppressed the pre-Christian or the pagan traditions that were much more earth-based, and that's the period that all the witches, were burned essentially as well. So that part of our history that I feel is such a major trauma that we now have to engage fits very much with that perspective of it, the kind of traditions that only focus on the transcendence, the God that's kind of out there rather than actually immanent and present in the parts and with the earth as well.
Yes, I think there is a definite connection there between overemphasizing the transcendent, minimizing the immanent, and overemphasizing the male and suppressing the female. There's a definite connection there, I think, historically, yes. The transcendent.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the transcendent-oriented religions that saw the world as an illusion, or in Christianity, for example, medieval Christianity saw the world as sin or sinfulness. There does seem to be a need for those religions to denigrate the female principle, which seems to symbolize manifestation.
Yeah. Would you like to talk through like some of the parallel, let's say how this, what we're talking about, and the model shows up in different traditions?
Sure. I mean, if we go back to the original model just for a moment, the one bit I didn't quite get a chance to say is that one of the areas that the traditions approach, and also I talked with David Bohm, Krishnamurti has addressed, is how does the whole actually become multiplicity? And one of the ways that it does that is by the introduction of dualism, the introduction of difference. The one becomes the two becomes the many. It talks about in Taoism. And one of the primary dualisms or primary distinctions or differences that is made is between the subject and the object, or between the self and other, or between consciousness and matter, yin and the yang. There are many different forms this takes, but it's as if the whole is split into this primary two-ness, this primary dualism, and then that process continues in some sense to produce multiplicity, which is the world of diversity.
Mm-hmm. Now, would this be the same as what Bohm and Krishnamurti mean when they talk about, because they spend a lot of time talking about the observer and the observed? Is it the same dualism?
I think it's very much related, yes. Yeah.
And so
because they both talk about the observer and the observed, that difference or that dualism, while being functionally necessary, is one, if we take it too seriously or if we believe it too firmly, that can then spiral out of control into not only multiplicity but fragmentation. So it's the creation of the self as opposed to the other.
Yeah.
So we contract away from wholeness and we create an experience of selfhood, which is separate to the rest of the universe.
Yeah. And I guess we come to believe that something can be 100% objective, right? Which ultimately, if we think about it, because if it's always through the perception of the subject, like, then those two things are always related. So there's never going to be, right, in this perspective, a complete objectivity. That, right? Or that, yes. Would that be a fragment? That would be a fragmentation, right? To believe that there's complete objectivity.
Yes, because the subject and object are interrelated at a deeper level of the whole. Perfect objectivity just can't be possible because the subject can never separate itself in absolute terms from the object. And when we believe it can, like you just said, and that's what is believed by, as opposed to science, by scientism, where science starts to believe it's the only way to get truth. In scientism, you have a fragmentation where objectivity becomes an absolute, and in fact, the only way to get truth.
It reminds me of some. Sorry.
Yes, and when we fall for that absolutism, then again we're fragmented. But thankfully, science in the last century is beginning to challenge this idea that subject and object can truly be absolutely separate.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of some of Dean Radin's research recently, where they've shown that the belief of the researcher, how that influences the outcome of the research that they're doing. Fascinating work. I think it was in his book, Real Magic. But yeah, that whole idea that you can actually completely objectively research something is, I think you're right, is starting to fall apart. Thank goodness. So would you like to move on and look at some of the parallels?
Yes, let's look at some parallels with David Bohm's work and Krishnamurti's work.
So we've got this basic foundation here, which is the ground, which is the non-dual, everything, right? We can't really say much about. And then we've got the whole and the multiplicity living side by side. And what enables that distinction is kind of the subject, object, self, and other, as it were. And then what we're looking out for is when we forget that the multiplicity is connected in the whole, then we get the fragmentation, which can lead to so many of the troubles. Okay, so let's see how you've kind of linked this to other. This is David Bohm's kind of version, as it were, then.
So this is where we see the same structure of reality, if you like, in David Bohm's work. So David Bohm believed that underneath the world of separate things and events, underneath space-time, was what he referred to as the implicate order, which is an underlying wholeness that is not accessible to our senses or to our normal conceptual thinking, but out of which the explicate order, which is the normal world of separate things that we see, unfolds in each moment. And he describes it as follows: the explicate order unfolds in one moment and then enfolds or goes back into the implicate order in the next moment. And there's a constant moment to moment unfolding and enfolding between the implicate and the explicate. So what is explicate in this moment will be implicate in the next moment, and so on. And that is how we generate what we call the universe, the world we experience.
Right.
Now, according to David Bohm, mind and matter, which corresponds to what I originally called subject and object, or consciousness and matter, or consciousness and energy, or consciousness and information, information and matter. There are different ways of wording it. These are relatively autonomous subtotalities that emerge out of the underlying totality. So the underlying totality is the implicate order. Consciousness and matter emerge as sub-wholes or subtotalities out of this underlying order. And then their interaction generates the normal three-dimensional world of space-time in which we live.
I guess a simple way to think about this as I look at it is, well, because the mind can see matter, then you see many things, right? So that's almost by definition, that's what generates the multiplicity and the explicit order. The moment that there's me and the other, and I can see all the definitions and distinctions, but that you're saying that's the kind of core dynamic, the moment that differentiation happens, as it were, bringing in consciousness or awareness so that we can observe and be witness to the multiplicity around us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is something that is happening in each instant. It's not a historical thing that takes place over long periods of time. It's in every moment. You can, in deep meditation, you can actually see this happening in each moment. In each moment, mind and matter separate, and then they together generate the explicate order. And in the next moment, all of that enfolds back again into the underlying whole, and that cycle continues. And also what's interesting and important to mention is that when the explicate order enfolds back into the implicate order in the next moment, the implicate order has changed,
Right.
because it doesn't just go back to what it was.
Right.
It now enfolds what is new in the next moment.
So is
That
it
is how
like the Akashic record, in a way, that, you know, through the actions in the implicate order, that is recorded in the field, as it were, which is the implicate order that's also then generating the next explicate order.
Yes, exactly, yes.
Ah.
So that is how we can think of evolution. The implicate order, it's not only, evolution isn't only taking place in the explicate order, it's not only multiplicity that's evolving, the whole is also evolving. And in fact, the two of them, implicate and explicate, evolve together in a kind of dance.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like Rupert Sheldrake talks about the morphogenetic field, you know, these patterns essentially in the information fields that influence how things happen in the explicate order, but are also, well, Ken Wilber would talk about the cosmic grooves, you know, that are created through our ways of thinking and through our patterns. That it's like, I often think of it as like a path through a forest or something. You know, the first person has to hack their way through, and makes it easier for the second person, and the more people who walk the path, as it were, makes it easier for other people to follow. So it's like the clearer the pattern in the implicate order, right, the easier it is, I guess, for somebody to pick it up in the explicate order, which can be a good thing, but I guess can also mean it's easy to get stuck in just downloading the old patterns from the implicate order.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yes, I think the patterns that we lay down in the implicate order can be either healthy or unhealthy. And if unhealthy grooves are laid down in the implicate order, then they can be difficult to undo. These become cosmic habits and human habits. And in a way, to use Krishnamurti language, the human psyche or the human consciousness field becomes polluted with these unhealthy patterns that we're laying down in the implicate order.
And so it's only really when we're able to become conscious of those that we can start to, in a way, step out of them and make conscious choices, not just to follow that groove, but to make a different choice, to start to lay down a new pattern, in a way, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And I think also these patterns are what the traditions in the East refer to as karma.
That's karma.
What we refer to as karma, that in this model would be the patterns that we contribute through our own living to the implicate order, and which will then come back to influence our life and the lives of others in ways that are not causally determinate at the level of the explicate, right, because they're happening at a deeper order.
So is it also fair to say that, like quantum physics talks about, it says you can only really talk about things as probabilities, that in the implicate order, that's the world of probabilities in terms of things manifesting. So it's never a definite kind of cause effect. You can definitely predict it, but the clearer the pattern, I guess, the higher the probability that something might emerge in the explicate order. Is that the right way to think about it?
I'm not sure. It could be, yes. I think certainly the implicate order, we have to think of that, I think, as the ground of creativity. So any kind of creation or creativity comes out of the implicate order. So we can't make it absolutely deterministic. It has to be probabilistic. So like you said, in quantum mechanics, what a particle is going to do in the next moment, we can never know that with certainty. We only have a probability wave function that, you know, it's 30% it might do this, 60% it might do that. That might be a good analogy of how the implicate order might work, yes. Otherwise, we just have a purely deterministic machine.
Right.
And I think if we had if everything was perfectly determined in that way, evolution would never happen, because evolution by definition has to be the creation of something new. So I think
right.
we have to be talking.
Do you want to move to the next one?
Yep, let's do that.
This is Krishnamurti's language then.
Okay, in Krishnamurti's language, we see a similar function, a similar structure here. So Krishnamurti, when he's talking and elaborating his teaching, usually starts from the bottom up. So he starts with human conflict and he says, what is the reason for human conflict? And in Krishnamurti's analysis, the reason for human conflict is thought. Human thought has gone wrong. Human thinking has run away with itself and is creating destructive divisions which don't match how reality really is. In other words, this is Bohm's fragmentation, and that causes conflict between people, conflict between ourselves. And Krishnamurti also brought in the notion of time in a way that was quite original. He makes a distinction between what he calls chronological time and what he calls psychological time. Now, chronological time is the normal passing of time in the manifest world in the explicate order. And that in itself is not problematic. But when we take the notion of time into areas where time is not applicable, in other words, where chronological time fragments, we get psychological time. So an example of that would be, well, that person hurt me 10 years ago. I'm holding on to that memory. I want my revenge. Or this race of people attacked my ancestors 100 years ago. So I don't want anything to do with people from that race. It's a carrying on of past to present to future in a way that's fragmentary, in a way that is built upon divisions that don't really exist.
Is that really about attachment? So both of these things, that we can either be attached to something from the past, but just as equally we could be attached to an ideal vision of the future. And either way, they take us out of the present, which is the problem, right? Or we could be attached to a thought and just let that thought kind of pull us away from our sensing of what's really true in the moment. Is that where attachment comes in?
Yes, I think past, present, and future have their place in chronological time. So, certain things happened yesterday, certain things will happen tomorrow. But when we hold on to the past and future, like you just said, with psychological attachment, in ways that are not appropriate, in ways that are not healthy, then that becomes conflict, that becomes psychological time. So Krishnamurti makes this distinction between healthy thought and time and unhealthy thought and time, which leads to conflict. And at the root of that, in Krishnamurti's thinking, is the distinction between the observer and the observed. And it's in that distinction, when we take that distinction too far, in Krishnamurti's words, that's the beginning of all misery. We see ourselves as fundamentally different from the thing we're looking at. And in so doing, we begin the process of fragmentation, division where it's not necessary, not appropriate, not even real, ultimately. But and that's about as far as Krishnamurti went in his teachings for many decades. But when he met David Bohm, and particularly in a marvelous series of discussions they had, which is in a book called The Ending of Time, Bohm pushed Krishnamurti into talking about what lies beyond the observer and the observed. And Krishnamurti talks hesitantly, but he does mention in these dialogues that if we can somehow heal the division between the observer and the observed, there is behind that what he refers to as just this energy, just this universal energy out of which the world comes and back into which the world goes. He also talks about it as emptiness, as the universal mind. But essentially, this is the cosmos, the cosmic mind, out of which the observer and observed emerge, and then out of which thought and time emerged. And then together they also go on to talk about the ground, which again is the non-duality, the non-difference between this underlying energy and the world that comes out of this energy, the cosmos that arises out of this energy. So they say something quite interesting. They say the particular dies into the universal dies into the ground. And when the universal dies into the ground, the particular re-emerges, and you then have a non-dualism between the whole and the part, between the universal and the particular. And if you can embody that in your life, that's the way to start to live without conflict.
It's in your book, like the last section with with David Bohm. Really, I think it's like David Bohm unleashed. It's beautiful. But there's this bit where he kind of summarizes this, and he says, we need to remove the illusion that I exist in time. One depends on the other. Once you remove the illusion that you exist in time, it becomes impossible to sustain the illusion that the observer is not the observed. Right? The minute you say you exist in time, you must have that separation. So he seems to be kind of bringing in Krishnamurti's language there, and really that I guess appealing for that. When he then goes on to talk about a practice of presence that implicitly generates a feeling of interconnectedness with all that is there with you in that moment, and therefore the observer, and therefore there may be an observer and observed, but they're not seen as separate, right? They're seen as interrelated. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful piece at the end there.
Yes.
Well, look, we're steaming through our time here, Nishad, because it's 6 already. We've got like another 20 minutes or so. And, we could, of course, because we've done 9 hours of this already. But maybe we can just briefly touch on, how this pattern shows up in other traditions, because I think that's really powerful to notice the
Let's move through these slightly more quickly then.
Yeah.
So I've taken Hinduism as a tradition from the East. So here we have the ground of all being, which is the non-dual ground that underlies everything, which Hindus refer to as Brahman, the absolute, not the absolute, sorry, the non-dual. Now, when we separate out the whole and the part, the whole is often personified in Hinduism as what they call Ishvara, which is the personal God, or the cosmic mind, or the supreme divine mind. So that corresponds to what we refer to as the whole. And that cosmic mind has a male and a female face, Shiva and Shakti, which is the subject and the object, the observer and the observed. Their interconnection produces the play or the game of the universe, which we call Leela, which is play, game. But when that game is taken too far, we forget that it's a game. We forget the underlying wholeness. We forget the interconnection of all the parts of Leela. Then Leela becomes Maya, which is illusion. So we fall from Leela, which is play, into Maya, which is illusion.
Yeah. Oh, that's really important, because that's the thing. Maya is the word I often hear, some folks saying, oh, it's all Maya, it's all an illusion, and we need to get out of it. But really, it's all Leela. Right?
Yes. Maya is something we create.
Right.
Maya isn't really out there. Maya is something we create because of our human consciousness having taken a wrong turn somewhere. The world as it is in itself, if it makes sense to talk about it that way, is not Maya, it's Leela. So the world is real, completely real, but we bring unreal elements into it. And that's how Leela becomes Maya.
And those unreal elements are essentially the separation, our belief that these things are actually separate, and forgetting of the connectedness. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. Great. So
and also I'll just...
Oh, you want to go back, or?
Yeah, just for 30 seconds. I just mentioned that the whole process whereby Brahman manifests as all these levels all the way down to Maya, that's referred to in Hinduism by some thinkers as involution, which is the opposite of evolution. And when we find our way back to enlightenment through these different levels going back to Brahman, Hindus refer to that as evolution. So there's a constant cycle going on of involution and evolution.
Yeah. That's where the evolution theory came from, because I was like, it's got to be one process, not two, and it's got to be less linear than it is. So what do involution and evolution have in common? Well, if you drop the in and the air, you get volution. And what does that actually mean? Spin. And it's funny because the image I'd had in mind was the torus, and everything spins. Cells spin, the planet, the galaxies. So that was the pattern I was seeing there in between the two. Anyway, it's not time for evolution now, but so the Christianity.
Okay, so I thought I should bring in a Middle Eastern tradition as well, just to see how universal these patterns are. So in Christianity, what we have is the ultimate reality, which we could refer to as God, or Christian mystics refer to as the Godhead. The state of perfect wholeness. If we think of heaven as a metaphor for how life should be, a metaphor for perfection, then heaven can be seen as a state of wholeness, a perfect wholeness. And earth is where we live, where the manifest world. So that's the explicate order, the multiplicity. And the primary dualism in Christianity can be seen as the dualism between the body and the soul. So the soul, if you like, is the subject. That's who we really are. That's the bit that survives when we die in Christianity. The body is who we seem to be when we're incarnating on earth. But that bit will die, that we won't take that with us. So we have a separation of soul and body. We live on earth, and that's not a problem. So God, heaven, soul, body, earth. The problem arises when we become disconnected from heaven and God, and then earth falls into sin. So what Christians refer to as sin roughly correlates with what I'm referring to here as fragmentation.
So the whole process, when we act in a way that doesn't honor the relationship that is intrinsically there, right?
Yes, when we reject, in Christian terms, when we reject heaven, we reject God, we're rejecting the whole. We're falling permanently into dualism, and that is what is signified by the story, the myth of Adam and Eve. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we take dualisms like good and evil too seriously. We believe they're absolutely real, and there's a fall into the sinful world.
Yeah, beautiful. It's so clear when you kind of explain it like that, and we see this pattern. So, so with Ken, this is Ken's language, Ken Wilber's language. Then,
okay. So just again, I'll move up from bottom. So we have the gross world in which we live, in which, generally speaking, we see things as separate. We lose our sense of interconnection. And that can lead to the kind of problems we almost necessarily have in the gross realm. When we move into what Ken Wilber refers to as the psychic realm, that's when we start to see clearly the interconnection between things. And we start to see that the manifest world is actually really one, because everything connects with everything else. So that's multiplicity rather than fragmentation. Going up briefly to the whole, the level of wholeness is the level of emptiness or energy, which is the causal, what Wilber refers to as the causal. And the realm that we can see as, if you like, what comes between the causal and the psychic is the subtle realm. And this is where the initial distinctions like subject and object and male and female, yin and yang, start to find differentiation in their original subtle archetypes. But the ultimate truth, if you like, is that causal, subtle, psychic, gross, they're all really not different from one another. And that realization is the non-dual realization. That is what we've referred to as the ground.
Right. Okay, what else have we got? Oh yeah, okay, what's this?
Right, now, what I've tried to do here is to show how the diamond model, this is slightly different now, how can the diamond model be used to analyze some of the actual problems that we see in the world? So, in other words, is there a practical application of this diamond model to actually look at specific issues going on in the world. So the first one I looked at here was fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism. So if you like, the underlying whole that lies behind the different religious traditions is what we could refer to as the esoteric. There is an esoteric common core that lies behind the different religious traditions of the world. If you go deeply into the mystical essence of the traditions start to converge. We start to see great similarities. So the esoteric is wholeness in the context of religion.
Mm-hmm.
What then happens is we separate out between the surface structures and the deep structures of religion. So whereas the deep structures are those universal structures that religions have in common, the surface structures are the very different forms that religion has taken
Mm-hmm.
because of different cultures, different languages, different times in history, and so on.
Mm.
And when we take that separation too far, we lose sight of the deep structure. We only look at the surface structure, and then we get the exoteric religion, which is, this is where religions become parts. So different religions become different from one another, and we lose sight of the underlying oneness. We actually get different traditions that think that they are different.
Right. So
When
they're
those
focusing on the surface expressions and just seeing how they're different, and then they're disagreeing and fighting about those surface differences rather than connecting to the esoteric wholeness behind them, as it were.
Exactly. And that is clearly what has happened throughout history.
Yeah.
And when those exoteric differences are taken too far, we move from multiplicity to fragmentation, and we get fundamentalism.
Yeah. Wow. Clear.
So
you say you've got some more. So
yeah, I've got a few more.
Examples? Okay.
So wealth inequality. Let's have a look at another problem in society, in the world. So the wholeness here is the collective. So we've got human beings all over the world or in a given country seen as a whole, as a group, as a collective of people. We make a separation, a subject-object separation between me and us and the other. And when we take that separation too far, we get the individual. Yep. So
could we say that because here you've got like multiplicity in the model where you've got all the individuals, which is a good thing, right? Because you've got all this individual diversity.
Yes.
And then I guess it's when we forget that we're actually connected to these individuals, however different we may be on the surface, that we get the ego in the negative sense of the term.
Right. So when the individual remains connected to the collective, then the individual is still in the realm of multiplicity, and that is a healthy individuality. When that individuality is taken too far, we lose any sense of connection with the collective, then the individual becomes the ego. And that's when, in terms of, say, the problem of wealth inequality, we only think in terms of ourselves. We need to earn and generate and get as much as we can just for ourselves without thinking about others. And that is what leads to wealth inequality, because obviously some groups of people are far more efficient and effective at doing that than others.
Okay.
And we lose sight of any kind of vision of social justice because we've disconnected ourselves from society.
Yeah, and any sense of responsibility, as it were, for the other. Yeah, yes. Got it. Okay, environment.
The environment.
Big issues. You've nailed them all.
Yes. So here again, we have the wholeness here, which is nature, which includes human beings, and it's a unified whole. We separate ourselves out, subject and object, into the human and the environment. And so we get humans existing with a healthy separation initially from nature. But when we take that separation too far, then the human attitude to nature is to dominate and to exploit nature. So the human being becomes the dominator and the exploiter of nature.
Right. It's when we forget that we are actually the earth, which is a kind of dumb
Exactly.
thing to do, but we seem to have done it.
Yes.
We seem to manage to forget that we're the earth. So when we forget that, of course, it can become a separate object, right? Which we can engage with in a non-feeling way as we cut ourselves off from the body, emotion, earth, and then into this dominator exploiter role. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Is there any more?
There's one last one final one.
Corona. Look at this. Right.
So I thought I'd make this very topical. So here, what I've done is I've found what I think are correlates to each level of this model with the attitude of mind that we can use to approach the coronavirus.
Okay.
So if I start from multiplicity, which I've called here egocentric, this is where we're looking after ourselves, but in a healthy way, in a way that's reasonable. So we get in. I'll give you a few examples. We get enough food and supplies for ourselves. We wear masks when we go out. We socially distance from others. But when that egocentric becomes disconnected from the rest of the world and we only care about ourselves, that egocentric becomes toxic. So examples of a toxic approach to the coronavirus would be hoarding food and supplies to such a degree that other people fall short. Saying, well, I don't want to wear a mask because you're affecting my freedom and going out and possibly being a risk to others. Refusing to socially distance because it impinges on how I want to live my life. And again, that could then be a safety concern for others. So the egocentric, a healthy egocentric taken too far, can become a toxic approach to the coronavirus. Now, if I go up from egocentric to ethnocentric, here we start to see approaches to the virus that are based on a sense of identity, not only with ourselves, but with our group, our family, our church, our country. So some examples here. Now, I have to say, I have got some of these examples from the work of Bina Sharma, who's done some great work in this area. So some of the ethnocentric approaches here would be, well, we're going to blame the Chinese. It's not our fault. It came from another country. It's not the fault of this country. Or we follow the rules of our government. We care for our family, we care for our nation, but we don't care very much what happens to other countries or nations. So we want to be the first people to get the vaccine. We don't care that much if other people get the vaccine. And ethnocentric is also the level where we can start to engage in religious beliefs or magical beliefs about the coronavirus. So God is punishing the people who deserve to get this. If it's God's will that I'll get this, then I'll get this. If I say this chant every morning 10 times, then I'll be protected from the coronavirus. So that's the sort of ethnocentric approach. And then we can move on and go to the world-centric approach. Now here we think of the world as a whole, not just of us or our country. So this is the level where we start to follow what scientists are actually saying, because science is world-centric, it's not ethnocentric. Something that is scientifically true is true for every country, not just for my country. So at the world-centric level, we study the problem scientifically, we look for objective solutions to the coronavirus, we develop vaccines, we develop drugs, we study the statistics, we find the objective truth about this. And it's also at the world-centric level where we start to notice and be concerned about the inequities and injustices that might be going on. So why should this lot of people over here have far greater access to safety and medicines and vaccines, and that group of people over there not have access to it? These sorts of concerns start to arise at world-centric.
So there's an interesting kind of challenge there, because we talked about science and objective, and earlier on in the conversation we were saying, well, if you follow the model, there can never really be any true objectivity. So I guess we're talking about, as objective as possible, which I guess would mean as much of a buy-in as possible between different perspectives who seem to be finding the same thing, even though we couldn't say that was fully objective. I guess it's more the intersubjective checking that gets us somewhere where at least we could maybe agree that some things work and some things don't.
Yes, I mean, objectivity, we may never reach a perfect objectivity, but for practical purposes, for functional purposes like bringing the coronavirus under control, it has its limited use. And it works. As far as it goes, it works. Yeah.
I guess we're all really curious what the cosmocentric perspective is on the coronavirus.
Well, the cosmocentric would be the spiritual, non-dual approach to the coronavirus, which is probably an approach most of us aren't taking at the moment. But this is where we would look at the whole picture and we would say, well, maybe there are lessons here to learn from the coronavirus. We awaken to our own vulnerability. We awaken to our own mortality. We awaken to the interdependence between people and the earth. And if we take a very non-dual approach, we can even go so far as to say that ultimately this is just part of the process. Ultimately, nothing is better or worse than anything else. The creation of life, the destruction of life is the nature of things. Now, that's not a healthy approach to take independent of all the others.
Yeah.
But it's part of the overall picture if you want to take the highest view that you can possibly take. So that way we can rest as Shiva, we can rest in a higher place, but we can also do what is practical to deal with the coronavirus in the real world.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a tour de force. I think I just added, somebody was asking about the YouTube channel. Yeah, I added one slide here, just if you were looking for the YouTube channel, because as you see, we could be going on a lot longer. It's called Integral Reflections on Science and Spirituality. So feel free to, and I put the link in earlier in the chat. But we're going to have to wrap up in a sec, Nish, but I can't let us go without asking you, I mean, first of all, incredible. We called it the unity of everything, and you really made a case for an underlying pattern connecting all these different things, and also, I kind of identifying that fragmentation point as being really the key to the challenge at the moment. So we can't leave this without me asking you, what can we do ourselves in our own practices that will help keep us in that dynamic dance between the whole and the multiplicity without dropping into the fragmentation? Give us a few tips for navigating that.
Well, I think the first and perhaps most important step is to develop a very deep self-awareness of our own thinking and feeling processes, so that we become aware in our own daily life. And this isn't just done on a meditation mat. This is done in our relationship with people, because that's where the real problem lies. In our relationship with people, can we keep an awareness of how we are thinking and feeling in the context of that relationship, and be aware of how we constantly drop from multiplicity to fragmentation, from the part to the fragment, and how the root of that is in the separation between the observer and the observed? Can we see how we create that notion of separation and how we take it too seriously? And I think that can only really be seen in the context of relationship with others, through dialogue, through work relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships. In every relationship, this subject-object dualism makes itself known in different ways. And I think that's the key. Can we see that? Another way to refer to this is the self-contraction. How do we keep contracting away from that openness to the whole? Because it's that contraction that is at the root of all the problems. So yes, I would say an awareness of the self-contraction and find ways in life to open oneself up to the whole in different ways. Again, in relationship, through your work, through music, through art, if you have a spiritual practice. So yes, self-understanding and opening yourself up to the whole, I would say, are the two essential things to try to bring into your life somehow.
What really kind of resonates is that noticing when we do contract, noticing when we do fall into the fragmentation, but noticing without judgment, without whipping ourselves on the back, and a little inner smile of a kind of, oh, hello, there we go again. There's the contraction, or which somehow actually takes us out of it, because we notice so we're not it anymore.
Exactly.
And it's that like art of catching it and noticing it without judgment that in my experience is really powerful.
Yeah. We don't want any guilt here about self-contracting, because it's not something we're doing deliberately because we're bad people. It's just something that's built into the groove, the morphogenetic groove now.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's being done to us, through us. But awareness of that is the key, I think.
Yeah. Great. Well, Nish, wow, thank you very much for really kind of overview of really a deep pattern that seems to connect, and a sense, a real sense of also for our minds to be able to sit with, a sense of that deep interconnectedness between us all, that if we can just hold that perspective and feel that position, as it were, would make all the difference, I think, in the world. So thank you very much for joining us. And Jim, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am.
Handing back to you.
Thank you, Nish. What a
Thank you
tour
very
de
much.
force. And Peter, you're such a wonderful interlocutor. You bring out the depth and the best in everyone. So just thank you for that. And what I really loved about your dialogue today is the way you linked the metaphysical with the contemporary. I mean, just looking at the environment, looking at the coronavirus, looking at the various issues that you reviewed, and showing the different perspectives we have, whether we're viewing it from an egocentric or an ethnocentric or a world-centric or a cosmo-centric, is really, really profound. And I just want to acknowledge that, and to say that, Ubiquity University, Humanity Rising, this is pure Ken Wilber. This is integral thinking, which is drawing deeply from Bohm and Krishnamurti and others who ended up in a sort of, I would say, a non-dual position in terms of their perception of reality. And just worth just letting people know that Ken Wilber is actually the chancellor of Ubiquity University. He and I are very old friends, going back when I first met him in the 1980s, having read his first works and read just about everything he's ever written. And Peter's been deeply immersed in integral thinking. And in fact, the entire architecture of Ubiquity University's curricular design, Peter was the one that conceived it. And it's around the good and the true and the beautiful, or to use Ken's terms, the I and the we and the it, knowledge, self-mastery, and social impact. We have a holistic approach guided by Ken and integral thinking, but drawing from all kinds of other sources. And one of the principal sources is what's coming out of physics and cosmology right now. It's really amazing. And I just would say something that's implicit in what you both were talking about is that, what Nish, Peter are talking about from Bohm and Krishnamurti is radically new, but it's affirming the deepest awareness and sensitivities that human beings have had from the beginning of our spiritual awakening, back in the times of the Paleolithic age and the spirituality of the Mother Goddess. And, if you want to read an incredible account of this, read Anne Baring's work, The Myth of the Goddess, or her other major work, The Dream of the Cosmos. And, that's what's so exciting for me about being alive right now. We're witnessing transformation and revolution in every category of human concern as we instinctively are seeking to reinvent ourselves, while the world around us, we're trying to break through while everything around us is breaking down. And Peter and Nish, what you've brought into the ether today has been just simply marvelous and so deep. And I'm feeling just richly blessed by both of you. So thank you so much. And we want to invite everyone who would like to join the after chat session. We have a group of people. I mean, we've developed now a whole cadre of people who love to meet after our sessions, and it's on a webinar format so everybody can see each other. So Nish or Peter, if you can join for 5 or 10 minutes, the link is in the chat. But thank you all. This is what it's about. This is why we do Humanity Rising. It just paints a picture of human possibility that we can embody as we break through the breakdown and usher in a new and more beautiful world. So thank you, everyone. And then tomorrow, just to say a word about tomorrow, we're going to go and we're keeping on the theme. And we're bringing in a guy named Joe Truss, who's going to start sort of where Nish and Peter created the container. And that is, what is it actually that knits the whole thing together? When you talk about the unity of everything, what is it? And his assertion is, along with Pythagoras, that it's geometry. It's geometric forms, mathematical equations, and sounds that in the end are the interstices that keep everything that is, both visible and invisible, attuned, connected, learning for each other, and evolving into higher states of consciousness. So tune in tomorrow for another tour de force, this time on sacred geometry and how it knits the cosmos together as one. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow, 5:00 p.m. Central European Time here on Zoom. Bye-bye.